In 1984, a scientist in California cut a tiny scrap of dried muscle from a 100-year-old museum skin. And by doing that, he accidentally launched an entire branch of science that didn't exist yet. No one had ever pulled genetic information out of an extinct animal before. Not once. Not in all of human history. And the animal that made it possible wasn't a dinosaur, wasn't a mammoth frozen in Siberian ice, wasn't anything exotic at all. It was a zebra. Well, half a zebra, if you go by looks. Stripes on the front, plain brown on the back end, like nature got bored halfway through painting it. It was called the Quagga, and it had been dead for over a century by the time anyone thought to check what was hiding inside its cells. Here's the part that should stop you cold. What that scientist found didn't just confirm what people already believed about this animal. It quietly destroyed it. And when researchers kept digging over the following decades, using tools that didn't even exist in 1984, they found something even stranger. The Quagga you think you know, the one in the black and white photograph, the last of its kind, dying alone in an Amsterdam zoo in 1883, was never the separate species everyone assumed it was. And more than that, in a very real, very literal genetic sense, it may never have actually left. Stick with me for the next few minutes, because this isn't folklore. This isn't a maybe someday we'll clone it story you've heard 100 times about mammoths. This is documented, published, peer-reviewed science, and most people in the United States have genuinely never heard a word of it. By the end of this, you're going to look at extinction itself a little differently. Let's start with what people thought they knew, because the mistake is almost as interesting as the truth. When European settlers first encountered the quagga in southern Africa in the 1700s and 1800s, they saw an animal that looked like someone had started drawing a zebra and simply stopped. Stripes covered the head, neck, and front shoulders in bold black and white, but the pattern faded out toward the middle of the body and vanished completely by the hindquarters, leaving smooth, plain brown fur and white legs and belly. To the naturalists of the era, this wasn't a variation. This was a distinct animal entirely. They gave it its own scientific name, its own classification, its own identity, completely separate from the zebras roaming the plains around it. Charles Darwin himself treated it as its own species. That classification stuck for well over 100 years. And meanwhile, the animal itself was being erased. Dutch and British colonists in the Cape Colony viewed quaggas the same way they viewed most large grazing animals competing with livestock, which is to say, as pests to be shot. They were hunted relentlessly, not for sport particularly, not even primarily for hides, but simply to clear land for sheep and cattle. Wild populations collapsed through the mid-1800s. The last confirmed wild quagga is believed to have died sometime in the late 1870s. The very last individual on Earth, a mare, lived out her final days in a zoo in Amsterdam and died on August 12th, 1883. Nobody in that zoo realized in that moment that they were watching the final member of an entire lineage disappear. There was no ceremony, no headline, just a dead zebra in an enclosure and a species quietly gone. For the next 100 years, that was the whole story. Extinct animal, wrong place, wrong time, victim of colonial hunting. Tragic, but simple. Except it wasn't simple at all, and the reason we know that traces back to a small, strange decision made by a taxidermist in Cape Town in the 1960s. And his name was Reinhold Rau, and his job was working with preserved animal specimens at the South African Museum. In the process of remounting an old quagga skin for display, he noticed something odd. There was still a bit of dried muscle tissue clinging to the hide, tissue that had somehow survived over 100 years of storage. Most people would have discarded it without a second thought. Rao didn't. He kept it. And that decision, made by one meticulous museum worker who happened to be paying close attention, is the reason ancient DNA science exists today. By the early 1980s, a research team led by Russ Higuchi at the University of California, working with the San Diego Zoo, got their hands on preserved quagga tissue and asked a question nobody had seriously attempted to answer before. Could you extract usable genetic material from an animal that had been dead for a century? In 1984, they published their answer in the journal Nature, and it sent a shockwave through biology. Yes, you could. They successfully recovered short fragments of mitochondrial DNA from that dried muscle, and in doing so, they became the very first researchers in history to pull genetic sequences out of an extinct species. Not a fossil impression, not a bone shape. Actual DNA, the literal molecular code, still intact enough to read more than 100 years after the animal's death. This is the founding moment of an entire scientific discipline, now known as ancient DNA research, the same field that would go on to sequence Neanderthal genomes, woolly mammoths, and countless other extinct creatures. And it all traces back to a piece of zebra jerky sitting in a South African museum drawer. What that first fragile analysis suggested, and what dozens of follow-up studies over the next 30 years would go on to prove with increasing certainty, is the twist most Americans have never heard. The quagga was never actually its own species at all. Genetic testing showed again and again that the quagga's DNA was essentially indistinguishable from the plains zebra, the same widespread common zebra species you'd recognize instantly, the one found across huge stretches of southern and eastern Africa today, and still numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Researchers eventually reclassified the quagga formally as a subspecies of the plains zebra, giving it the scientific designation Equus quagga quagga, essentially demoting it from its own species down to a regional variant, similar to the way a Bengal tiger and a Siberian tiger are both tigers, just shaped by different environments. But here's where it gets genuinely wild, because the genetic story didn't stop at it's a subspecies. A landmark study published in 2005 using DNA pulled from 8 separate quagga specimens held in museums around the world found that the quagga had split off from the rest of the plains zebra population astonishingly recently in evolutionary terms, somewhere between roughly 120,000 and 290,000 years ago, likely during a harsh glacial period in Earth's climate history. In genetic terms, that is a blink. That's not ancient divergence like the split between horses and donkeys millions of years in the making. That's a population that separated, adapted to a colder, drier southern environment by losing its rear stripes and developing a darker, browner coat, and then got isolated at the very southern tip of Africa, right in the path of expanding European settlement. Even more striking, later genome-wide studies, including large-scale research out of the University of Copenhagen, analyzing tens of thousands of genetic markers across dozens of zebra samples, found that the traditional method of telling zebra subspecies apart, things like stripe pattern, body size, head shape, doesn't actually line up cleanly with the genetic reality underneath. The zebras form what scientists call a genetic cline, a smooth, gradual gradient of variation running from north to south across Africa, rather than neatly separated distinct groups. The quagga wasn't a unique branch on the family tree. It was the extreme southern end of a genetic slope that plains zebras occupy across the entire continent, the point where the stripe pattern faded out almost entirely because of local climate and selection pressure, not because it was a fundamentally different animal. So what actually killed the quagga? Not a unique species vanishing forever in the way we usually picture extinction, some singular, irreplaceable branch of life snapped off the tree. What died in 1883 was a distinctive regional appearance, a specific coat pattern shaped by thousands of years of local adaptation, riding on a genetic foundation that plains zebras across Africa still carry to this day, sometimes still expressing faintly in individual animals with reduced striping and brownish tints born in the wild right now. And that brings us to the second half of this story, the part that sounds almost like science fiction, but is very real, ongoing, and happening in South Africa today. In the early 1980s, after seeing the early DNA results suggesting the quagga wasn't genetically distinct, Reinhold Rau, the same taxidermist who preserved that original tissue sample decades earlier, proposed something audacious. If the quagga's genes were still present within plains zebra populations, scattered and diluted but not gone, could you selectively breed zebras generation after generation, deliberately choosing individuals with reduced striping and brownish coloring, and gradually reconstruct that lost appearance from within the living population? In 1987, his team captured a founding herd of 9 plains zebras from Etosha National Park in Namibia, chosen specifically because they already showed some quagga-like traits, less striping toward the rear, a hint of that brownish base coat. This became the Quagga Project. The first foal was born in December of 1988. Since then, the project has pushed through multiple generations of careful, selective breeding, and the results are honestly startling. By the third and fourth generations, breeders were already producing zebras with reduced striping patterns matching known museum quagga specimens. The project is now working through its 5th and 6th generations, and some of the animals being born look strikingly, unmistakably close to the creature that supposedly vanished forever in 1883. These animals are informally called Rau quaggas, named after the man who started it all, and scientists are careful to note they aren't a perfect one-to-one resurrection of the original quagga. They're a re-expression of a phenotype, a visual appearance, drawn back out of genes that were sitting dormant and diluted across living zebra populations the entire time. But the underlying implication is almost too strange to fully sit with. The quagga's genetic material never actually disappeared from the earth. It went into hiding, spread thin across a widespread, common, thriving species, waiting, essentially, for someone to go looking for it again. So when people say the quagga went extinct, that's true in the sense that mattered most. That specific, striking, half-striped animal walking the Karoo Plains of South Africa is gone, and nothing brings back the exact individual creature or its full evolutionary path. But the deeper genetic story tells you something most people never learn in school. Extinction isn't always a clean, permanent erasure. Sometimes what disappears is an appearance, a phenotype, a costume built from genes that are still out there, scattered through a living population, quietly waiting. The quagga wasn't a separate species snuffed out forever. It was the far edge of something much bigger that never actually stopped existing. And in South African fields today, animals carrying that same ancient genetic thread are being born again, right now, with stripes fading exactly where they used to fade over 140 years after everyone assumed the story was over.